Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished her evening workout at Mountain View Fitness Center. The small gym tucked away in the quiet suburb of Denver was her sanctuary, a place where she could blend in among the regular folks trying to stay in shape. At 32, she looked like any other working professional who valued fitness. Her athletic build was noticeable but not intimidating, her movements precise but not obviously military-trained. She had chosen this gym specifically because it was unremarkable. No elite training facilities, no special forces veterans, just regular people with regular lives. After 8 years of classified operations that she could never discuss, Sarah craved normalcy. Her official story was simple. She worked in government consulting and traveled frequently. The truth was far more complex and buried under layers of security clearances that would never see daylight. As Sarah packed her gear into her worn gym bag, she noticed a commotion near the martial arts section. A crowd had gathered around the practice mats where Marcus Chen was holding court. Marcus was impossible to miss. His black belt was prominently displayed, and he never let anyone forget about his various championships in mixed martial arts tournaments. He owned a successful chain of martial arts schools across Colorado and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged. The problem with most people today, Marcus was saying loudly enough for half the gym to hear, is they think watching action movies makes them tough. They have no idea what real combat training looks like. His voice carried that particular brand of arrogance that made Sarah's jaw tighten involuntarily. She tried to ignore him and head for the exit, but Marcus's voice followed her. Take women, for example. They think a few self-defense classes make them dangerous. It's almost cute, really. Several people in his audience chuckled nervously. Sarah paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She had dealt with this type before, men who had never faced real danger but spoke as if they owned it. I've been training for over 20 years. Marcus continued, warming to his theme. I've studied under masters in Thailand, competed internationally, built a business around real martial arts. Not this fitness kickboxing nonsense that soccer moms think is fighting. His eyes swept the gym dismissively before landing on Sarah near the exit. You there, he called out suddenly. The blonde by the door, you look like you work out. Bet you think you could handle yourself in a real fight. The gym fell quiet. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her back. This was exactly what she had moved to Denver to avoid. Unwanted attention, conflict, situations that might require explanations she couldn't give. Sarah turned around slowly, her expression neutral. I just come here to stay in shape, she said calmly. I'm not looking for any trouble. Her voice carried a slight Southern accent from her Alabama childhood before the military had taken her around the world and back. Marcus grinned, sensing what he thought was weakness. That's what I'm talking about. Most women think looking fit means being able to fight. It's two completely different things. He gestured to his small audience. Fighting is about technique, years of training, understanding leverage and timing. It's not about having nice shoulders from lifting weights. Something flickered in Sarah's eyes, but her voice remained steady. I'm sure you're very skilled, she said diplomatically. I should get going. She turned toward the door again, hoping the situation would de-escalate naturally, but Marcus wasn't finished with his demonstration. Hold on, he said, standing up from the mat. I'm not trying to embarrass you. I'm making an educational point. He walked closer, his black belt swaying with each step. How about this? I'll show everyone the difference between real training and gym fitness. Nothing serious, just some light sparring. I'll go easy on you, obviously. The gym had gone completely silent now. Sarah could see the gym manager looking uncomfortable but not wanting to intervene with one of the facility's most prominent members. Other patrons were pulling out phones, sensing drama. This was spiraling exactly where Sarah had hoped it wouldn't go. I appreciate the offer, Sarah said, her tone still remarkably even. But I really do need to leave. She glanced at the crowd that had formed. Maybe another time. The diplomatic response of someone trying to avoid conflict, which only seemed to embolden Marcus further. "Come on," Marcus pressed, spreading his arms wide in a gesture that appeared friendly but felt aggressive. "What's the worst that could happen? I'll teach you a few things. You'll get some real experience. Everyone wins, unless you're afraid." The last word hung in the air like a challenge that everyone could hear. Sarah set her gym bag down carefully and looked directly at Marcus for the first time. Her blue eyes were calm but intense, in a way that should have been a warning to anyone with real combat experience. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said quietly. "For either of us." Marcus laughed, a sound filled with false confidence. "Trust me, I've been doing this longer than you've probably been working out. I know how to control myself. You'll be perfectly safe." He gestured toward the mats. "Unless the government consulting business involves more danger than I thought." He had remembered her cover story from previous conversations at the gym. That comment hit closer to home than Marcus could possibly know. Sarah felt the familiar weight of keeping secrets, of pretending to be someone she wasn't. Every day she carried the memories of operations that had saved lives, of split-second decisions in hostile territory, of enemies who had underestimated her exactly once. She thought about her teammates who hadn't made it home, about the respect she had earned through blood and sacrifice in places whose names she could never mention. "Look," Sarah said, making one final attempt at de-escalation. "I really think this is a bad idea. Why don't we just call it a night?" But even as she spoke, she was mentally cataloging Marcus's stance, his balance, the way he carried his weight. Old habits from a life where such observations meant the difference between mission success and mission failure. Marcus shook his head with exaggerated patience. "You're overthinking this. It's just a friendly demonstration. What kind of message does it send if you back down now?" He looked around at the crowd for support. "Everyone here knows I'm not going to hurt you, right?" The crowd murmured agreement, but Sarah noticed a few faces that looked uncomfortable with the pressure being applied. She also noticed the emergency exits, the location of potential weapons, the number of witnesses, another set of old habits that had kept her alive in environments far more dangerous than a suburban gym. "All right," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying a note of resignation that wasn't entirely genuine. "But let's keep it light, like you said." She began removing her sneakers, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. "And when I say stop, we stop. Deal?" Marcus grinned triumphantly. "Absolutely. This is about education, not ego." He began stretching in a show of casual confidence, performing elaborate movements designed to display his flexibility and training. "I'll teach you some basic defensive positions, maybe a simple escape or two." As Sarah stepped onto the mat in her socks, she seemed smaller somehow, less imposing than she had a few moments before. Marcus topped her by at least 6 inches and probably 50 pounds. To the watching crowd, it looked like exactly what Marcus had presented it as. An experienced martial artist giving a lesson to a fitness enthusiast who was in over her head. "Ready?" Marcus asked, settling into what was clearly a practiced fighting stance. His movements were smooth and confident, the product of years of training and competition. "We'll start slow, just basic positioning." He raised his hands in a standard guard position. Sarah nodded and raised her own hands, but her stance was different. Subtly different in ways that most of the crowd wouldn't notice, but different enough that someone with real experience might have paused to reconsider. Her feet were positioned for maximum mobility rather than display. Her guard was practical rather than textbook. Her breathing was controlled in the way of someone for whom this was just another day at work. "Whenever you're ready," she said quietly, and for just a moment, her voice carried an undertone that Marcus's subconscious registered as dangerous, even if his conscious mind dismissed it. He was about to learn the difference between martial arts training and combat experience, between studying war and living through it. Marcus made the first move, stepping forward with a controlled jab that was clearly intended to be non-threatening. It was the kind of technique demonstration move that looked impressive to observers while giving his opponent time to react defensively. He expected Sarah to stumble backward or throw up a clumsy guard, providing him with the perfect opportunity to gently control the engagement and prove his point about training versus fitness. Instead, Sarah moved. Her response was so subtle that most of the crowd missed it entirely. She shifted her weight slightly, angled her body minutely, and Marcus's carefully controlled jab found nothing but air. She hadn't stepped back dramatically or thrown wild counterpunches. She had simply been where his technique wasn't, with an efficiency of movement that spoke of muscle memory drilled through countless hours of life or death training. "Good," Marcus said, masking his surprise with instructor-like approval. "You've got decent reflexes. Now let's try something a little more complex." He circled slightly, still maintaining his teaching demeanor for the crowd. But his movements carried a bit more intent now. The missed jab had been unexpected, and his competitive instincts were beginning to override his showmanship. Sarah remained in her deceptively casual stance, tracking Marcus's movement with peripheral vision while appearing to look directly at him. Her breathing stayed controlled, her muscles relaxed but ready. To the watching crowd, she still looked like someone out of her depth trying not to embarrass herself. They couldn't see the micro-calculations happening behind her calm exterior, the automatic threat assessment that had been ingrained through years of training with some of the most dangerous people on the planet. Marcus launched into a combination this time, a jab followed by a cross and a leg kick that demonstrated his technical proficiency. The moves flowed together smoothly, the result of countless repetitions in controlled environments. It was textbook mixed martial arts, executed with the precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting his craft. Sarah's response was not textbook anything. She moved like water, flowing around Marcus's techniques without appearing to try. Her counter-movements were small, efficient, and completely unexpected. When Marcus's leg kick came around, Sarah wasn't where she had been a split second before. When his follow-up punch cut through the space where her head should have been, she had already shifted to an angle that left Marcus slightly off balance and overextended. "Interesting," Marcus muttered, his friendly instructor mask slipping slightly. He reset his stance, now taking the engagement more seriously. The crowd sensed the change in atmosphere, the shift from demonstration to actual competition. Several people moved closer, phones out and recording, sensing they might be witnessing something unusual. For the first time, Sarah spoke during the sparring. "Maybe we should stop here," she suggested quietly, her voice carrying no strain despite the activity. "You've made your point about training." But there was something in her tone now, a subtle shift that Marcus should have recognized as a warning. It was the voice of someone offering a final off-ramp before things escalated beyond friendly demonstration. Marcus shook his head, his pride now fully engaged. "We're just getting started. You're doing better than I expected, but let me show you what real pressure feels like." He began to advance more aggressively, his movements sharper and more purposeful. The light sparring session was becoming something else entirely. What happened next unfolded so quickly that the crowd would spend weeks debating exactly what they had seen. Marcus launched a more aggressive combination, using his size and strength advantage to try to overwhelm Sarah's defensive movement. His techniques were still technically sound, but they carried real intent now, real power behind them. Sarah's response was devastating in its simplicity. She didn't block Marcus's attack or try to match his aggression. Instead, she stepped inside his combination at the exact moment when he was most committed to his attack, when he couldn't change direction or adjust his balance. Her movements were economical, precise, and utterly without hesitation. In less than 3 seconds, Marcus found himself face down on the mat with Sarah's knee pressed against his back and his arm hyperextended in a position that would require surgery to repair if she applied just a few more pounds of pressure. The transition from standing combat to complete control had been so smooth that many of the observers weren't entirely sure how it had happened. The gym fell completely silent, except for Marcus's labored breathing. Sarah held the submission just long enough for him to understand how thoroughly he had been outclassed, then released the pressure and stepped back, offering him a hand up. Her expression remained neutral, professional, as if what had just occurred was nothing more than a minor misunderstanding. Marcus struggled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. The confident martial arts instructor had been replaced by someone who clearly didn't understand what had just happened to him. "What? How did you—" He looked around at the crowd, then back at Sarah. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Basic self-defense classes," Sarah replied with the same even tone she had maintained throughout the evening. "Like you said, soccer mom stuff." But there was something in her eyes now, a glimpse of the steel beneath the suburban facade. "Maybe we could call it even?" The crowd was buzzing with confused excitement, people talking over each other trying to explain what they had witnessed. Several had their phones out, having captured at least part of the brief encounter. Sarah noticed the recordings and felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The last thing she needed was video evidence circulating online. Marcus rubbed his shoulder where Sarah's control hold had been applied. He was clearly struggling to reconcile what had just happened with his understanding of combat sports. That didn't look like any martial arts I've ever seen," he said slowly. "Those weren't sport techniques." "I really should get going," Sarah said, moving toward where she had left her gym bag. "Early morning tomorrow." She was already mentally composing the report she would need to file about the incident, already calculating how to minimize the exposure. This was exactly the kind of situation her handlers had warned her about when transitioning to civilian life. But Marcus wasn't ready to let it go. His competitive pride was warring with his growing curiosity about what he had just experienced. "Wait," he called after her. "I need to understand this. Those moves, that control, where did you really train? That wasn't self-defense class material." Sarah paused at the edge of the mat, her back still to Marcus and the crowd. She could feel their attention like a physical weight, could sense the questions forming in their minds. This was the moment where her carefully constructed normal life began to crack, where the truth she had worked so hard to bury started to surface. "Some instructors are better than others," she said without turning around. "Maybe you should look into expanding your curriculum." It was a diplomatic answer that revealed nothing while hinting at everything. The kind of response that intelligence operatives learned to give when questioned about skills they weren't supposed to possess. Marcus took a step closer, his voice dropping to keep the conversation between them. "That wasn't martial arts training," he said with certainty. "I've trained with Olympic competitors, special forces guys, people at the top of their game. What you just did was different. It was—" He struggled for the right word. It was operational. The word hung in the air between them like a live grenade. Sarah felt her muscles tense involuntarily, old instincts awakening at the suggestion that her cover might be blown. She turned to face Marcus, and for the first time all evening her mask slipped completely. The look in her eyes was flat, professional, and utterly without warmth. "I think you're confused," she said, in a voice that carried the subtle authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "It was just a lucky counter. Don't read too much into it." But even as she spoke, both she and Marcus knew that what had happened on the mat was far beyond luck or beginner's fortune. The tension in the gym was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus stared at Sarah with the dawning realization that he had stumbled into something far beyond his understanding. The crowd remained silent, sensing that they were witnessing more than just an upset in a sparring match. Several gym members were looking between Sarah and Marcus with confusion, trying to process how their quiet fellow member had just demolished someone who had seemed so confident in his abilities. Sarah grabbed her gym bag and headed for the exit, but Marcus called after her one more time. "Please," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "I need to know. That level of training, that kind of situational control. I've never seen anything like it outside of—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Outside of people who've done things they can't talk about." Sarah stopped walking but didn't turn around. The weight of maintaining her cover story was becoming heavier by the minute. Every instinct told her to leave immediately, to disappear into the night and never return to this gym. But something in Marcus's tone had shifted from aggressive curiosity to genuine respect, and she found herself hesitating. "You have no idea what you're asking," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the gym's ventilation system. "Some doors are better left closed." The warning in her tone was clear, but so was the acknowledgement that Marcus had correctly identified something significant about her background. Marcus took a few steps closer, speaking quietly enough that the crowd couldn't hear. "I spent 2 years training with a retired Navy SEAL instructor," he said. "He taught us some things that weren't in any martial arts curriculum, but what you just did was beyond even that. The way you moved, the control, the absolute confidence, that's not military martial arts training. That's something else entirely." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Marcus was getting dangerously close to territory that could compromise everything she had worked to build since leaving her operational life behind. But she could also hear something in his voice that she recognized. The sound of someone who had touched the edge of the real world and understood how much he didn't know. She turned around slowly, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the sparring session had ended. "Let me give you some advice," she said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "There are people in this world who do jobs that don't officially exist. They train in ways that aren't taught in schools or dojos. They develop skills that are designed for situations where second place means death. And when they retire from that life, they just want to blend in and be normal." The gym had gone completely silent now. Everyone was straining to hear the conversation, sensing that something significant was being revealed. Sarah noticed the attention and felt exposed in a way that brought back memories of being behind enemy lines with compromised cover. Marcus nodded slowly, beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had stumbled into. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time all evening, his voice carried genuine humility. "I had no idea. I was just showing off, trying to prove a point about training. I never meant to put you in this position." "The problem with people like you," Sarah said, echoing his earlier words but without malice, "is that you think training in gyms and competitions prepares you for the real thing. You learn techniques and forms and rules, and you start to believe that's what fighting actually is." She gestured toward the mats where they had sparred. "What just happened wasn't martial arts. It was muscle memory from places where the rules were different." A woman in the crowd stepped forward hesitantly. "Are you military?" she asked with the careful respect that civilians often showed when they suspected they were talking to someone who had served. "My brother was a Marine. He moved differently after he came back, like he was always ready for something." Sarah looked at the woman for a long moment, weighing her response. The simple truth was complicated by years of classified operations and security clearances that would never expire. "I served," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. "Different kind of service than most people think about." Marcus was putting the pieces together now, his martial arts instructor ego replaced by growing amazement. "Special operations," he said, not quite a question. "But not regular special forces. Something beyond that. His voice carried the awe of someone beginning to understand just how outclassed he had been. "There are programs that don't get talked about," Sarah said, neither confirming nor denying his speculation. "Units that work with other agencies, handle situations that require different skill sets. The kind of training they provide isn't about sport or self-defense. It's about staying alive in environments where everything is trying to kill you." The crowd was hanging on every word now, fascinated by this glimpse into a world they had only seen in movies. But Sarah was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the attention, with the way her carefully maintained cover was unraveling in real time. Marcus shook his head in wonder. "Delta Force," he said quietly, the words barely audible. "Maybe SEAL Team 6. And you've been coming here for months, just working out like anyone else." He laughed, but it was the laughter of someone who had discovered how little he actually knew about the world. "I've been pontificating about martial arts to someone who's probably saved lives in ways I can't even imagine." "I came here because it was normal," Sarah said, a note of sadness creeping into her voice. "Because nobody asked questions about where I learned to fight or why I sometimes wake up at 3 in the morning listening for sounds that aren't there. I just wanted to be another person trying to stay in shape." The vulnerability in her admission struck the crowd into respectful silence. They were beginning to understand that they had witnessed not just an impressive display of skill, but the accidental revelation of someone struggling to find their place in a normal world after experiences that were anything but normal. Marcus stepped forward and extended his hand formally. "I owe you an apology," he said, "and probably dinner, and maybe a year's worth of humble pie. I made assumptions about you that were completely wrong, and I put you in a position you didn't ask for." Sarah looked at his outstretched hand for a moment, then shook it briefly. "You couldn't have known," she said. "That was the point." She shouldered her gym bag and looked around at the crowd of faces staring at her with new understanding. "I'd appreciate it if what happened here stayed here. There are reasons people like me try to stay invisible." The gym manager stepped forward, clearly overwhelmed by the evening's events. "Of course," he said quickly. "Absolutely. And ma'am, you're welcome here anytime. Always." His voice carried the deep respect that Americans typically reserved for those who had served in ways beyond normal comprehension. As Sarah headed for the exit, Marcus called after her one final time. "For what it's worth," he said, "thank you. For your service and for the lesson. I needed both more than I realized." Sarah paused at the door and looked back at him. "Next time you want to prove a point about training," she said with the ghost of a smile, "maybe pick someone who learned their moves in a dojo instead of a war zone." With that, she disappeared into the Denver night, leaving behind a gym full of people who would never look at quiet, unassuming strangers the same way again. Marcus stood alone on the mat, staring at the door where Sarah had vanished. His black belt felt suddenly insignificant around his waist, a reminder of how much he had yet to learn about the world and the people who moved quietly through it, carrying secrets and skills that could never be fully understood by those who had never walked in their shoes. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the conversations would continue for weeks. They had witnessed something rare and powerful. The collision between civilian assumptions about strength and the reality of those who had earned their capabilities in the crucible of genuine danger. It was a reminder that heroes often looked like ordinary people, and that the most dangerous individuals were frequently the ones who seemed the least threatening. Sarah Martinez drove home through the quiet Denver streets, already planning her conversation with her handler about the incident. Her cover wasn't blown, but it had been tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. As she pulled into her driveway, she reflected on Marcus's words about just wanting to be normal. It was a goal that seemed perpetually just out of reach for people like her, those who had seen too much, done too much, and carried too many secrets to ever truly blend into the suburban dream they had fought to protect.